The Missouri River moved like a serpent through the land, its muddy waters carrying stories older than memory. Ayanna crouched at its edge in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers trailing through the current as she had done since childhood. The water was colder than usual for late spring, speaking of distant mountain snows, still melting in territories her people would never see again. She was 23 winters old, though the soldiers who had begun arriving 6 moons ago would have guessed her younger. Her face held the stillness of deep water, revealing nothing of the currents beneath. Her dark hair, woven with small shells her grandmother had given her, caught the first hint of dawn as she studied the river's flow, reading its moods the way others read tracks in mud. Behind her the village stirred to life. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of corn cakes and dried fish. Children's voices rang out, bright and careless, not yet understanding how their world had changed. Ayanna turned from the water, her eyes moving to the fort that now squatted on the high ground 2 miles upriver. The wooden structure had appeared like a scar on the landscape, built by men who called themselves soldiers of a distant president. They wore blue coats that absorbed the summer heat and carried weapons that spoke thunder. Their leader, Captain Marcus Thornhill, had arrived with papers bearing seals and signatures that meant nothing to Ayanna's people, declaring that this land now belonged to a nation called the United States of America. Ayanna's uncle, Chief Tashunka, had tried negotiation first. He was a man who had seen 50 winters, who remembered when the French traders came and promised respect for indigenous sovereignty. The Americans made no such promises. They spoke of progress, of manifest destiny, of civilization marching westward. What they meant, Ayanna understood, was erasure. The first confrontation had come 3 moons past, when soldiers destroyed 4 of their best canoes, claiming they needed the wood for fortifications. When Tashunka protested, pointing to the endless forest surrounding them, a lieutenant named Samuel Crawford struck him across the face with a riding crop, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. Ayanna had been there, standing beside her uncle, watching the casual violence in Crawford's eyes. He was a tall man, with pale skin that burned red in the sun, and light eyes that looked through indigenous people, as if they were no more substantial than morning mist. That night, she began planning. But planning required understanding, and understanding required proximity. So Ayanna did what no one expected. She approached the fort the next morning, alone, carrying a basket of fresh fish and wearing her most unthreatening expression. The guards, young men far from their own homes, were suspicious at first, but hunger and loneliness eroded their caution quickly. "You speak English?" one guard asked, his accent thick with what she would later learn was Kentucky drawl. "Some," Ayanna replied, deliberately keeping her vocabulary simple, her grammar imperfect. "French trader teach. I bring fish. Trade for salt?" It was a lie wrapped in truth. She spoke English far better than she revealed, having learned from a missionary who had passed through years before, a man who believed indigenous souls needed saving, but who had at least been generous with his language lessons. She had learned French from the traders, Spanish from travelers passing through. Languages were tools, and Ayanna collected tools the way some collected weapons. The guards accepted the fish. One of them, a boy who couldn't have seen more than 18 summers, smiled at her with such loneliness in his eyes that Ayanna felt an unwelcome pang of sympathy. He introduced himself as Private James Whitmore, from a place called Virginia, and spoke of his mother's cooking and his sister's letters as if Ayanna were someone who might care. She returned the next day with more fish. And the day after that, within a week, she was allowed into the fort compound where she observed everything: the patrol schedules, the supply deliveries, the tensions between officers and enlisted men, the way Captain Thornhill drank heavily after dark, while Lieutenant Crawford enforced discipline with a cruelty that even the other soldiers whispered about. Most importantly, she observed the river. The fort had been built on high ground, yes, but the soldiers had chosen their patrol routes poorly. They followed what looked like easy paths along the riverbank, not understanding that the Missouri was a living thing that changed its mind with each season. What appeared solid in summer became treacherous quicksand in spring. What seemed shallow could hide undertows strong enough to pull down a horse and rider. Ayana knew every such place within 10 miles. She had learned them as a child, taught by her father who had drowned in one when she was 12, his body never recovered. The river had taken him, and in her grief she had sworn to understand it so completely that it could never surprise her again. Now, standing at the water's edge, as the sun finally broke the horizon, she watched a patrol of 5 soldiers riding along the northern bank. Lieutenant Crawford led them, his posture rigid with military bearing, his horse the finest among them. They were heading toward the disputed fishing grounds, where her people still tried to maintain their traditional rights despite increasing harassment. Behind her she heard footsteps. She didn't turn. She knew her grandmother's tread as well as she knew the river's voice. "You spend much time watching them," the old woman said in their own language, settling beside Ayana with the careful movements of advanced age. "Someone must," Ayana replied. "Your uncle thinks you play a dangerous game, becoming friendly with the bluecoats. My uncle thinks diplomacy will save us. He thinks if he is reasonable enough, patient enough, they will see us as human beings deserving of the land we have lived on for generations." The old woman was silent for a long moment, watching the patrol disappear around a bend. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much history. "And you do not think this?" "I think," Ayana said carefully, "that they see us the way they see the trees they cut down, obstacles to be removed for their progress." Her grandmother reached out, touching the shells in Ayana's hair, with fingers gnarled by arthritis, but still gentle. "These were your mothers. She would not want you to become something dark in fighting darkness." "Mother is dead," Ayana said, harder than she intended. "Taken by the sickness the French traders brought. Father is gone, taken by the river. Our way of life is dying, killed by men who call us savages while they burn our food stores and defile our sacred places. I will not sit quietly and watch it happen." The old woman sighed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Then be careful, granddaughter. The river is patient. Those who use it for violence must remember that it has no loyalty. It will take what it is given, but it may demand more than you wish to pay." Ayana nodded, but she had already made her choice. That choice solidified 3 days later when soldiers stormed the village at dawn, claiming to search for stolen army property. They found nothing because nothing had been stolen. But that didn't stop them from destroying winter food stores, scattering carefully preserved seeds, and terrorizing families in their homes. Lieutenant Crawford personally overturned clay pots containing dried corn, grinding the precious grain into the mud with his boot heel, while a young mother watched, her infant crying in her arms. When the woman's husband tried to intervene, Crawford's men beat him unconscious with rifle butts. Ayana watched from the doorway of her uncle's lodge, her face carefully blank, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. She watched, and she remembered every face, every act of casual cruelty, every moment of violation. That night she went to the river and began her real work. The moon was waning, the darkness deep enough to hide movement. She waded into the cold water, feeling her way to a section where spring floods had created deceptive terrain. What looked like solid footing from the bank was actually a thin layer of silt over churning quicksand. She marked the safe approach with small stones, arranged in patterns only she would recognize, patterns that would be invisible to soldiers who didn't know how to read the land. The next morning she brought fish to the fort again. Private Whitmore greeted her with his lonely smile. "You weren't harmed yesterday?" he asked, genuine concern in his young voice. "During the search? No harm," Ayana said, maintaining her broken English. "But people scared, much scared. "The lieutenant, he can be harsh," Whitmore said, lowering his voice and glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "But Captain Thornhill says we have to maintain order, says you people don't understand authority unless we show strength." Ayana said nothing, just nodded as if accepting this as truth. Inside, she felt the cold clarity of purpose settling over her like ice forming on still water. These men would never see her people as human. Strength was the only language they truly understood. "I know good fishing," she said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Down river, much fish. Soldiers want fish." Whitmore's eyes lit up. Fresh fish would be a welcome change from the salted meat and hardtack that made up most of their rations. "Could you show us? Maybe guide a small patrol?" "Yes," Ayana said, keeping her voice eager and helpful. "I show. Good place. Easy to reach from here." She described a location downstream, a place where the river bent sharply and fish did indeed gather in eddies near the bank. What she didn't mention was that the easiest path to reach it required crossing what appeared to be a shallow ford, but was actually treacherous during spring runoff. A person on foot, moving carefully, could navigate it safely. Soldiers on horseback, heavy with equipment and weapons, would be in far greater danger. Private Whitmore reported her offer to his sergeant, who reported it to Captain Thornhill. The captain, always eager to find ways to reduce food costs and demonstrate his command's resourcefulness to his superiors, approved the expedition immediately. He assigned Lieutenant Crawford to lead it, along with 4 enlisted men. When Ayana learned who would be leading the patrol, something cold and fierce bloomed in her chest. Crawford, the man who had struck her uncle, the man who had destroyed her people's food with such casual cruelty. If she had harbored any doubts about what she was planning, they evaporated like morning dew. The crossing point appeared in the distance, exactly where Ayana had described it. The river widened here, spreading across a broad expanse that looked shallow enough to wade. Sandbars broke the surface in several places, and the water ran clear over what appeared to be a firm gravel bottom. To Lieutenant Crawford and his men, it looked like an easy ford, the kind they had crossed dozens of times in their westward journey. Ayana knew better. She knew that beneath that innocent surface, the spring melt had carved new channels, creating powerful undertows that could pull a grown man off his feet. She knew that what looked like solid sandbars were actually shifting accumulations of silt that would give way under weight. Most importantly, she knew the safe path across, a narrow line of genuinely solid ground that required precise navigation. She pointed across the river. "Fishing place there," she said to Crawford. "See, where water calm. Many fish." Crawford squinted across the ford. Indeed, on the far bank, the water formed quiet eddies perfect for fishing. He could see the dark shapes of fish moving in the shallows. "How deep?" he asked Ayana. "Not deep," she assured him, gesturing to her thighs. "Horse, no problem." This was technically true. The safe path across never exceeded the depth she indicated. The dangerous paths, which looked identical to untrained eyes, could drop suddenly to depths over a man's head. But Ayana didn't mention that distinction. Crawford considered for a moment, his eyes scanning the crossing. Behind him, Private Whitmore shifted uneasily in his saddle. The young man had more instinct than his lieutenant, some primal sense that whispered warnings. But he was too junior to voice concerns without invitation. "You first," Crawford ordered Ayana. "Show us it's safe." Ayana had anticipated this. Without hesitation, she began wading into the river, following the exact route she had memorized. The water rose to her knees, then mid-thigh, but never higher. The current pushed against her, but she moved with it, reading its flow, placing each step precisely. In less than 2 minutes, she reached the far bank and turned, spreading her hands as if to say, "See, easy." What the soldiers couldn't see was that she had crossed at an angle, following a submerged ridge of stone and packed clay. The straight path they would naturally take on horseback would miss that ridge entirely, dropping them into channels where the current ran treacherous and deep. "Simple enough," Crawford said, spurring his horse forward. "Stay in formation. Watch your footing." Ayana watched from the far bank as the 5 soldiers entered the water. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm, encouraging. She waved them forward, calling out directions that were deliberately vague. "Yes, yes, come straight, is good." Crawford's horse went first, the animal stepping confidently into the river. For the first several yards, everything seemed fine. The water rose to the horse's chest, but the animal was strong and the bottom seemed solid. Behind Crawford, the other 4 soldiers followed in a loose line. Then Crawford's horse stepped off the submerged ridge. The change was instantaneous. One moment the animal was wading through chest-deep water. The next it plunged into a channel that dropped away beneath its hooves. The horse screamed, a terrifying sound that echoed across the water. Crawford, caught completely off guard, fought to stay mounted as the current seized them both. The lieutenant was a capable rider and a strong swimmer. In calm water he might have managed the situation, but the Missourian spring was anything but calm. The current that looked so gentle on the surface had real power beneath, and it caught Crawford and his horse like a giant hand. The animal thrashed wildly, its hooves seeking purchase that didn't exist. Crawford tried to dismount, to separate himself from the panicking animal, but his boot caught in the stirrup. Behind him, chaos erupted. The second horse, ridden by a corporal named Davies, tried to back away from the drop-off, but stepped into unstable silt. Its rear leg sank suddenly, throwing Davies forward over its head. He hit the water hard and surfaced sputtering, his heavy coat and equipment dragging at him. Private Whitmore, at the rear of the formation, pulled his horse up short, his young face pale with fear. The other 2 soldiers, both privates, tried to help their struggling companions. One managed to grab Davies's collar and begin pulling him toward shallower water. The other rode toward Crawford, reaching out to try to free the lieutenant's trapped foot. Ayana watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. She had set these events in motion, but now they developed according to their own terrible logic. Crawford's horse, still thrashing in the deep channel, struck the rescuing soldier's mount with its flailing hooves. The second horse reared, dumping its rider into the current. Crawford finally wrenched his foot free from the stirrup, but the effort cost him his grip on the saddle. The current took him, pulling him under. He surfaced 10 feet downstream, gasping, his face twisted with rage and fear. His heavy uniform and weapons belt pulled at him like anchors. "Help the lieutenant!" someone was shouting. "Get a rope!" But the remaining mounted soldiers were too far away, still trying to navigate the treacherous crossing. Crawford went under again, his arms thrashing wildly. When he surfaced this time, he was further downstream, his movements weaker. Ayana could have helped. She knew where the current would push Crawford, knew which sandbar he would be swept toward. She could have waded out along the safe path and positioned herself to pull him from the water. She had the strength and the knowledge. Instead, she stood perfectly still on the bank, her face arranged in an expression of helpless concern. Inside, she felt nothing. No triumph, no horror, no regret. Just a cold certainty that this was necessary. That Crawford's death would send a message to the other soldiers, that sometimes survival required watching your enemies drown. Crawford went under a 3rd time and didn't resurface. The Missouri took him the way it had taken Ayana's father, swallowing him into its muddy depths. His body would likely never be recovered, carried miles downstream and buried in silt, becoming part of the river's secrets. The surviving soldiers finally made it to the far bank, pulling their horses onto solid ground with shaking hands. Davies was soaked and coughing, but alive. The 2 other dismounted soldiers had managed to swim to safety. Only Whitmore remained on horseback, his young face stricken with shock. They stared at the river where Crawford had disappeared, as if expecting him to resurface at any moment. The water flowed on, indifferent, revealing nothing. "Christ," Davies whispered. "Christ almighty." Ayana approached them slowly, her eyes wide with manufactured distress. "I sorry," she said, her voice trembling convincingly. "I not know water so bad. Spring make river angry? I sorry." She wrung her hands, the picture of a simple native woman overwhelmed by tragedy. None of the soldiers saw through the performance. They were too shocked, too focused on their own survival and the horror of watching their commanding officer drown before their eyes. Corporal Davies was the senior enlisted man now, thrust into command by Crawford's death. He was a career soldier, 30 years old, with experience enough to keep his head in a crisis. He looked at Ayana, then at the river, then back at his shaken men. "Not your fault," he said heavily. "River took him. Could have been any of us." Ayana nodded gratefully, her role still intact. Davies organized the survivors, checking them for injuries, accounting for lost equipment. 2 rifles gone to the river's bottom, Crawford's sidearm and sword with him, 1 horse injured but able to walk. The men themselves bruised and shaken but functional. "We need to get back to the fort," Davies decided. "Report what happened. The captain will need to know." "I show safe way back," Ayana offered. "Not cross river again. Go around, take longer but safer." Davies accepted this immediately, clearly wanting nothing more to do with the Missouri's treacherous waters. They set out on the return journey, following a path along the south bank that would eventually loop back to the fort. It would add hours to their trip, but no one complained. As they walked, Private Whitmore fell into step beside Ayana. His face was still pale, his hands trembling slightly as he led his horse. "You really didn't know?" he asked quietly. "About how dangerous that crossing was?" Ayana looked at him, this boy so far from home, and something twisted in her chest. He was the only one who had shown her any genuine kindness, who had treated her like a person rather than a useful tool or an obstacle. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth. But the moment passed. The truth would serve no purpose except to ease her conscience, and her conscience was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not while her people were being systematically driven from their land. "River change all the time," she said instead. "What is safe one moon is danger next moon. I think I know, but I wrong. I very sorry." Whitmore nodded, seeming to accept this, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, or maybe just the first stirrings of deeper thought. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. How long before he started questioning what had happened? How long before someone wondered why the native guide had crossed safely while the soldiers had not? They reached the fort as the sun was setting, painting the Missouri's waters blood red. Captain Thornhill emerged from his quarters, his face already flushed with evening drinking, his eyes narrowing as he counted the returning patrol. "Where is Lieutenant Crawford?" he demanded. Corporal Davies stood at attention and delivered his report. Thornhill's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, a cold calculation. He looked at Ayana, who stood quietly to one side, her eyes downcast. "You led them to this crossing?" "Yes, sir," Ayana said in her broken English. "I crossed many times before. I not know spring make so dangerous. I very sorry." Thornhill studied her for a long moment. Ayana kept her expression humble and distressed, betraying nothing. Finally, the captain waved a dismissive hand. "Damned river," he muttered. "Damned treacherous country. Get out, all of you. Davies, organize a search party for tomorrow, though I doubt we'll find anything." They were dismissed. As Ayana walked away from the fort, back toward her village in the gathering dark, she felt the weight of what she had done settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had killed a man today, not with her hands, not with a weapon, but killed him nonetheless. Crawford had been cruel, violent, a man who had terrorized her people without remorse. The world was arguably better without him. But that didn't change what she had become in removing him from it. She was no longer just Ayana, the quiet fisherwoman who knew the river. She was something else now, something harder, something willing to watch a man drown and feel nothing but cold satisfaction. Her grandmother met her at the edge of the village, one look at Ayana's face telling her everything she needed to know. "So," the old woman said, "it is done. It is begun," Ayana corrected. One soldier gone changes nothing. There are dozens more, and more will come. This was just a message. And what message have you sent, granddaughter? Ayana looked toward the river, dark now under the rising moon, flowing eternal and unconcerned with human affairs. That this land is not theirs to take without price, that we are not helpless, that the river remembers its children, and it will defend them. The old woman shook her head slowly, sadly. The river has no loyalty, child. It will take theirs, yes, but it will take ours as well, if we feed it enough death. There is a darkness in this path you walk. Then let there be darkness, Ayana replied, her voice hard as riverstone. They have already taken our light, our land, our food, our dignity. They beat my uncle and call us savages. They destroy our homes and claim it is progress. If fighting back makes me dark, so be it. I will be whatever I must be to protect what remains of our people. 3 weeks passed before Ayana returned to the fort. The search for Crawford's body had been abandoned after 5 days of fruitless effort. Captain Thornhill, faced with reporting the loss of an officer to his superiors, had written the incident up as a drowning accident caused by unfamiliarity with local terrain and the unpredictable nature of spring runoff. No blame was assigned to Ayana, though she noticed some soldiers now looked at her with subtle wariness. She used those 3 weeks to observe without being seen, learning the new patrol patterns the fort had established. Captain Thornhill had replaced Crawford with a man from the ranks, a sergeant named William Hayes, who had been promoted to lieutenant. Hayes was older than Crawford, 40 if he was a day, with grey threading through his brown hair and scars that spoke of experience in other conflicts. He was professional, competent, and significantly less cruel than his predecessor. This created a problem for Ayana. Hayes didn't abuse the indigenous population. He enforced military discipline without unnecessary violence. His patrols were firm but fair, and he had even stopped one of his men from harassing a woman gathering water. If all the soldiers were like Hayes, Ayana's strategy would have to change entirely. But they weren't. There were still men like Corporal Thomas Brennan, a thick-shouldered Irishman who drank heavily and picked fights, who had beaten an elderly fisherman for being too slow to move out of his path. There was Private Jacob Richter, young but vicious, who had laughed while destroying sacred items during one of the fort's searches. These men and others like them remained threats. When Ayana finally approached the fort again, carrying her usual basket of fish, Private Whitmore was on gate duty. His face lit up when he saw her, genuine relief in his expression. "You came back," he said. "I was worried. Some of the men said you might not, after what happened to the lieutenant." "River is dangerous," Ayana said simply, "but forts still need fish, yes? Trade's still good for both?" Whitmore nodded eagerly, accepting the fish and paying her in salt and small coins. As they conducted their transaction, Ayana studied him. He looked thinner than before, his uniform hanging a bit looser. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "You look tired," she observed, allowing more English fluency to show than she usually did. "You are well?" The young private glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then lowered his voice. "Bad dreams," he admitted. "About the river, about Lieutenant Crawford going under. I keep seeing his face." Guilt twisted in Ayana's stomach, an unwelcome sensation. She forced it down, maintaining her sympathetic expression. "Death is hard," she said. "First time seeing someone die?" "No," Whitmore said. "I saw men killed in training accidents back east, but this felt different. The way the river just took him, like he was nothing." He paused, then looked at Ayana with troubled eyes. "Can I ask you something? And will you answer honestly?" Warning bells rang in Ayana's mind, but she nodded. "You crossed that ford safely," Whitmore said carefully. "You knew exactly where to step. But the lieutenant, experienced as he was, got pulled under almost immediately. How did you know the safe path when he didn't?" This was the moment. Ayana could feel it balanced on a knife's edge. Whitmore wasn't accusing her, not exactly. He was just a young man trying to make sense of a trauma, looking for patterns that might explain the inexplicable. But if she answered wrong, if she gave him reason to truly doubt, everything could unravel. "I am lighter," she said, keeping her voice gentle and reasonable. "I walk, not ride. I know to feel with feet, to test each step. River talk to me through feet. Lieutenant ride horse. Horse heavier, move different. Horse step where I not step, find different bottom. Also," she added, "I know that crossing since child. My body remember path even when mind forget. Lieutenant never crossed before. Very sad. I wish I think to warn better, but my English not so good. Maybe if I explain more clear." She trailed off, letting tears well in her eyes. It wasn't difficult. Some part of her did feel genuine regret, though not for the reasons Whitmore would assume. The young private's face softened immediately. "No," he said quickly. "It wasn't your fault. I didn't mean to suggest. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." Ayana wiped at her eyes, sniffing convincingly. "I think many times," she said, "what I could do different. How I could save him. But river is river. Sometimes it take people, and we cannot stop." Whitmore nodded, looking miserable at having upset her. The moment passed. The danger deflected. But Ayana filed away the interaction for future consideration. Whitmore was observant, thoughtful. He might become a problem if more incidents occurred. She would need to be more careful around him. Over the following weeks, Ayana resumed her routine of trading fish at the fort. She listened to the soldiers' conversations, learned their gossip and complaints. She discovered that Captain Thornhill was under pressure from his superiors to establish more effective control over the territory, to open it for further settlement and development. The fort's mission was expanding, which meant more patrols, more presence, more pressure on Ayana's people. It also meant more opportunities. Corporal Brennan was assigned to lead a patrol into the northern forests, tasked with mapping potential roads. His team was small, just 3 men total, and they needed a guide familiar with the terrain. Lieutenant Hayes suggested Ayana, noting her reliable service despite the tragic accident with Crawford. Ayana accepted the assignment with apparent eagerness. She knew the northern forests well, including a particular stretch where the land became treacherous with hidden bogs and sinkholes. In summer, these areas were dry enough to cross. In spring, fed by runoff from higher elevations, they became deadly traps that could swallow a man whole. She spent 2 nights before the patrol lying awake, wrestling with her conscience. Brennan was a brute, yes, but the 2 men assigned to him were unknowns. One might be cruel, one might be kind. She couldn't know. And yet, if she let this opportunity pass, how many more indigenous families would Brennan terrorize? How much more damage would he do? Her grandmother found her sitting by the river on the night before the patrol. "You are troubled," the old woman observed. "I am becoming what I swore I never would," Ayana replied. "A killer, no different from them." "You are very different from them," her grandmother said sharply. "They kill for conquest, for greed, for the pleasure of domination. You act to protect. The intention matters." "Does it?" Ayana asked. "When I watch a man die, when I guide him to his death deliberately, does my intention change the reality of what I've done?" The old woman was quiet for a long moment, staring at the river's dark waters. "No," she said finally. "Your intention does not change the act, but it changes who you are while performing it. They are murderers who enjoy their violence. You are a warrior who carries the burden of necessary death. The difference is in your soul, not in the world's judgment." "And what if carrying this burden breaks my soul?" Ayana whispered. "Then it breaks," her grandmother said with terrible gentleness. "And you bear that too, because someone must. Better you, who agonizes over each death, than someone who would embrace the darkness gladly. Your suffering is the price of remaining human while doing inhuman things." The next morning, Ayana met Corporal Brennan and his men at the fort. One of the soldiers was Richter, the young private who had laughed while destroying sacred items. The other was a man Ayana didn't recognize, an older soldier named Peterson, who looked at her with neither hostility nor kindness, just professional neutrality. They set out north into forest country, following trails that wound between massive trees. Brennan was in a foul mood, complaining constantly about the heat, the insects, the difficulty of mapping such dense terrain. Richter echoed his complaints with an edge of malicious energy. Peterson said little, just did his job with quiet competence. Ayana led them deeper into the woods, following paths she had walked countless times. She knew exactly where she was taking them, though she maintained the fiction of simply searching for the best route for potential road construction. The area she had in mind was low-lying, where water collected during spring runoff, creating bogs hidden beneath deceptive vegetation. As they walked, she found herself studying Peterson. He was probably 50, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors. He moved with the careful efficiency of an experienced woodsman. When they stopped to rest, he shared his water without being asked, and she saw him leave small offerings of food near a bird's nest they passed. This man was not her enemy, Ayana realized with sick certainty. He was just a soldier doing his duty, probably counting days until he could return to whatever family waited for him back east. But he was part of the patrol, and if she acted against Brennan and Richter, Peterson would be there. He would see, he would report. The moral calculation was brutal. 3 men, 2 certainly deserving of whatever fate found them, 1 innocent, or at least not actively guilty, but to neutralize the threats, all 3 would have to be dealt with. The alternative was to do nothing, to guide them safely, and know that Brennan and Richter would continue terrorizing her people. Ayana felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was what war meant. Not glorious battle where warriors fought warriors, but this sick calculus where innocents died alongside the guilty. If she went forward, she would carry Peterson's death for the rest of her life, a permanent stain on her soul. But if she didn't go forward, how many more Indigenous children would grow up watching their elders beaten? How many more families would lose their homes, their food, their sacred places? She made her choice. Again. As she knew she would keep making it until something stopped her or her people were safe. The weight of it pressed on her like a physical burden, but she straightened her shoulders and bore it. They reached the boggy area as afternoon shadows lengthened. Ayana pointed out what appeared to be a clearing ahead, suggesting it might make a good campsite or waypoint for a future road. "Looks solid enough," Brennan grunted, starting forward. "Wait!" Peterson said suddenly. "Something doesn't look right about that ground." Ayana's heart lurched. The older soldier's experience was showing. He had spotted the subtle signs that indicated unstable terrain. "Is fine," Ayana said quickly. "I cross many times." "See?" She stepped forward onto the clearing's edge, following the narrow path she knew was safe. The ground held firm beneath her light weight. She walked several yards in, then turned and beckoned. "See? Safe. Come." Brennan followed without hesitation, his heavy boots striking the ground with confidence. Richter came next. Peterson hesitated, his experienced eyes still reading warning signs, but when the first 2 men made it several steps without incident, he followed. That was his fatal mistake. The path Ayana followed was real but narrow, a slightly elevated ridge of more solid ground. The soldiers, walking in a loose group rather than single file, diverged from it. Brennan stepped to the right, following what looked like equally firm terrain. The bog took him instantly. One moment he was walking, the next he was sinking, the ground that had appeared solid revealed as a thin crust over deep mud. Brennan shouted in alarm, trying to pull himself free, but his struggles only made him sink faster. Richter moved to help, but stepped wrong himself, breaking through the crust. He went down to his waist in thick mud, his rifle falling from his hands. Peterson, more cautious, tried to back away, but the unstable ground was all around them now. His left leg punched through and he fell forward, catching himself on his hands, only to have them sink into the muck as well. Ayana stood on her safe ridge, watching 3 men struggle against terrain that would not release them. The bog was patient, inexorable. The more they fought, the deeper they sank. Brennan was already up to his chest, his face red with exertion and growing panic. "Help us!" Richter screamed at her. "Get us out!" Ayana could help. She knew exactly where to place a long branch to give them leverage, knew how to distribute weight to avoid breaking through herself. She could save them. All of them. Even Peterson, who now looked at her with sudden, terrible understanding in his eyes. "You knew," Peterson said, his voice strangely calm despite his predicament. "You knew this ground was bad. You led us here deliberately." Brennan and Richter stopped their struggles for a moment, looking between Peterson and Ayana. "Is that true?" Brennan demanded. "You savage bitch! Did you lead us into a trap?" Ayana met Peterson's eyes. She saw no hatred there, just a kind of sad resignation. He understood why, even if he didn't agree. He knew what his people had done, was doing, would continue to do. He just hadn't expected to pay the price for it personally. "I'm sorry," she said to Peterson, meaning it. "You did not deserve this, but you are part of what destroys my people, and I cannot let that destruction continue." Peterson nodded slowly, then closed his eyes. He had stopped struggling, understanding that fighting would only hasten the end. Brennan and Richter had no such acceptance. They screamed threats, curses, promises of revenge. They thrashed and fought and sank steadily deeper. Their anger would have been frightening if Ayana hadn't already crossed so far into darkness that their rage meant nothing to her. She turned away before the end, unable to watch, but knowing it would come. The bog would take them slowly, over hours perhaps, their struggles exhausting them until they could no longer hold their heads above the surface. It was a terrible way to die, and Ayana carried that knowledge like a weight of stones. The fort erupted when Brennan's patrol failed to return. Search parties were organized, led by Lieutenant Hayes himself. They found the bodies 4 days later, or what the bog had left of them, preserved but grotesque in the thick mud. Hayes was experienced enough to recognize what had happened. The terrain had been treacherous, yes, but the positioning of the bodies suggested they had been deliberately led into danger. Ayana was brought to the fort under armed guard. Captain Thornhill, his face purple with rage and grief, confronted her in his office, while Hayes and several other soldiers stood witness. "4 of my men are dead," Thornhill said, his voice shaking. "Lieutenant Crawford in the river, Corporal Brennan and 2 privates in that godforsaken bog, and you, conveniently, were the guide for both incidents." Ayana maintained her broken English, her expression confused and frightened. "I not understand. I try help, show good places, but land dangerous, spring make everything dangerous. I very sorry for—" "Enough!" Thornhill roared. "Do you think I'm stupid? 4 men, woman. 4 deaths, and you walk away from both without a scratch." Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "Captain," he said quietly, "Private Peterson was an experienced woodsman. He would have spotted dangerous ground, unless someone very familiar with the terrain deliberately concealed the danger." He turned to Ayana, and she saw understanding in his eyes. Not accusation exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. "You led them there," he stated, knowing what would happen. For a long moment, Ayana considered maintaining her act. But looking at Hayes, at Thornhill's apoplectic rage, at the other soldiers who had drawn weapons and were clearly ready to execute her on the spot, she realized the performance no longer mattered. They knew, or at least suspected strongly enough, that denial was pointless. She straightened, letting the submissive posture fall away. When she spoke, it was in clear, unbroken English. "Yes," she said simply, "I led them there. I knew what would happen." The admission shocked them into silence. Thornhill's face went from purple to white. "You admit to murdering my men?" he whispered. "I admit to defending my people," Ayana replied. "Your men came to our lands uninvited. They destroyed our food, burned our homes, beat our elders. Lieutenant Crawford struck my uncle across the face for protesting the theft of our canoes. Corporal Brennan terrorized families, destroyed sacred items. What would you have me do? Ask politely for you to stop?" "This land belongs to the United States now," Thornhill said. by right of the Louisiana Purchase. Your people have no claim. Your government purchased land from France, Ayana interrupted. France never owned this land. My people have lived here for generations beyond counting. You cannot sell what is not yours, and you cannot claim what you have stolen. This is theft dressed in legal papers, and I will not apologize for fighting back. Lieutenant Hayes made a small sound, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. When Ayana looked at him, she saw something like respect in his eyes, alongside the sadness. "You're a warrior," he said, "fighting a war with the only weapons available to you. I understand that, even if I can't condone it." "Understanding is worthless without action," Ayana replied. "You know what your government is doing is wrong. You see the injustice, but you enforce it anyway." "I'm a soldier," Hayes said. "I follow orders." "Then you are as guilty as the rest," Ayana said. "Perhaps more so, because you know better, but choose complicity." Thornhill had regained his composure, though fury still radiated from him. "She admits to murder," he said to Hayes. "There's no question of guilt. She must be executed." Before Hayes could respond, the door burst open. Private Whitmore stood there, breathing hard, as if he had run a distance. "Captain," he gasped, "the village, the Indigenous settlement, they're armed, gathering warriors. Someone must have warned them. We arrested her." Thornhill's eyes widened, then narrowed with calculation. Ayana felt her heart sink. She had planned for her own death, accepted it even, but she had not considered that her capture might spark a larger conflict. "How many?" Thornhill demanded. "Maybe 30 warriors," Whitmore said, "plus women and elders. They're not attacking, just positioned, waiting." Thornhill paced, his military mind working through options. Hayes watched him carefully, and Ayana saw something pass between the two officers. A silent communication, a shared understanding of what might happen next. "If we execute her," Hayes said quietly, "they'll attack. We'll win. We have superior firepower, but we'll lose men. And then we'll have to send out more patrols, and those patrols will face exactly the kind of guerrilla tactics she's been using. This entire territory will become hostile." "Are you suggesting we let her go?" Thornhill asked incredulously. "I'm suggesting we negotiate," Hayes replied. "She's admitted guilt because she knows she's caught. But she's also proven she's intelligent, resourceful, and willing to talk. Maybe we can reach an understanding." Ayana watched this exchange with careful attention. Hayes was offering her survival, but at what cost? What understanding could possibly exist between her people and these invaders? "What are your terms?" she asked Hayes directly. The lieutenant looked at Thornhill, who gave a curt nod. Permission to proceed, though the captain clearly hated the necessity. "Your people stay away from the fort," Hayes said. "No more incidents, no more dead soldiers. In exchange, we reduce our patrol presence in your immediate territory. We establish clear boundaries. You can fish, hunt, live your lives without interference, as long as you don't interfere with us." "For how long?" Ayana asked. "Until more settlers come? Until the boundaries you offer today become too restrictive for the nation's expansion tomorrow?" Hayes's silence was answer enough. They both knew this was a temporary solution at best. The westward expansion would continue. More settlers would come, more pressure would build, and eventually the fragile peace would shatter. "But it buys time," Hayes said finally. "Maybe years, maybe long enough for circumstances to change, for better treaties to be negotiated. I can't promise more than that because I don't have the authority. But I can promise this, under my command, as long as your people keep the peace, we will too." Ayana studied the lieutenant's face. She saw sincerity there, but also the weariness of a man who knew he was fighting against historical inevitability. Hayes was offering what he could, within the constraints of a system neither of them controlled. "I want my uncle, Chief Tashanka, included in these negotiations," she said, "and I want it written, an official agreement signed by your captain." "Done," Thornhill said, though he looked like the word tasted bitter. "But if there's one more incident, one more dead soldier, the deal is void, and we come in force. Understood?" Understood, Ayana replied. And if your soldiers violate our territory or harm our people, the same applies. It was agreed. The formal negotiations took place the next day, with boundaries drawn and documents signed. The fort reduced its patrols as promised. For a time there was peace. Uneasy, fragile, but peace nonetheless. The peace lasted 3 years. Then new commanders arrived, Hayes was transferred, and the cycle began again. But Ayana was no longer at its center. She had married, had children, taught her daughters to read the river and understand its secrets. She told them stories of what had happened, of the choices she had made and the prices she had paid. Her grandmother died when Ayana was 30, passing peacefully with final words about how the river remembers everything. Years later, when Ayana herself was old and grey, when her people had been forced onto smaller territories until barely anything remained, she would sit by the Missouri and think about those words. The river did remember. It flowed on, unchanging in its essential nature, even as everything around it transformed. It had taken Crawford, Brennan, Richter, and Peterson. It had witnessed her transformation from peaceful woman to quiet warrior. And it would continue flowing long after she was gone, carrying secrets in its muddy depths. On her final visit to the river, too old now to wade into its currents, Ayana found herself thinking about Peterson, the soldier who had understood, who had accepted his death with dignity. "I did what I thought I had to do," she said to the river, to Peterson's memory, to herself. "I don't know if I was right. I carried the weight, bore the burden, lived with the nightmares. That's all I could offer in payment for what I took." The river offered no absolution, no judgment. It simply flowed, as it always had and always would, patient, eternal, indifferent to human moral struggles. Ayana died that winter, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were in her native language, a prayer to the river to carry her spirit home. They scattered her ashes in the Missouri, as she had requested. The current took them immediately, pulling them downstream, distributing them across miles of water. Her story was never officially recorded. There were no monuments to Ayana, no plaques commemorating her resistance. The soldiers she had killed were listed in military records as casualties of frontier service. The truth remained hidden, known only to her descendants and the river itself. But stories have a way of surviving. Ayana's grandchildren told their children, who told theirs, and the tale of the woman who fed soldiers to the river became part of oral tradition. The details shifted over generations, but the core remained. A woman who fought back. A woman who used intelligence and knowledge of the land to resist invasion. A woman who paid the price for her choices and carried that weight with dignity. In the end, perhaps that was all anyone could ask. Not to be remembered perfectly, but to be remembered at all. To have fought when fighting seemed necessary. To have protected when protection seemed possible. To have remained human even while doing terrible things. The Missouri River flows on, as it did in 1804, as it does today. Its waters still hide secrets, still claim the unwary, still remember everything it has witnessed. And somewhere in its depths, mixed with silt and stone and the bones of countless others, rest the remains of 4 soldiers and 1 indigenous woman who all, in their different ways, were casualties of a war that never officially existed. A war for land, for sovereignty, for the right to exist. A war fought with weapons and words, with violence and diplomacy, with strategy born of desperation. A war that produced no heroes, only survivors and ghosts. And the river, indifferent witness to it all, continues its eternal journey to the sea,